There we go. Okay. So as you guys come in, I apologize. I know this is quite the delay. It's going to post eventually. This is actually my laptop. It's not, the computer doesn't allow, they actually updated the settings and they deleted everything. So as you can tell, I got OBS to work on my laptop. Hopefully I'm fairly clear. I'm using, I don't know what camera I'm looking at. So I've got so much stuff. So you should be able to see me. My video quality isn't that important, so if you want me to shrink down more, if you want me to move out of the way, I can do that. I just know that people have given feedback that they want to be able to see the individual talking. There's no one in this classroom, but I am on a public site, so I'm going to keep wearing the mask. But I want you to be able to hear my voice and sort of see my face as we're talking. I might get a better zoom in or something like that as we get through. We're still going to take a break at 9:40, and then we're going to come back at 10 o'clock because I have a ton of material to cover. I'm really excited about it. So once we get through, I can run some of that. Just let me see how many people sort of come in. And just so you know, if you can't comment, if you're watching this and you can't comment, if you can't comment on YouTube or you don't want to make a profile, you can comment in the chat for now, you can comment in the chat on Web Campus. There's a Web Campus, you just hit chat and you go through there. Now, for those, I think some people are actually in the WebEx right now, or they probably emptied out of that. WebEx is not working on the campus computers. The permissions were shut off, so that's just part of the problem. So I'm waiting for a few more people to come in. I know that I sort of threw everyone off, but let's just get into this, and then as you have questions, sort of text in, and then hopefully classroom services is supposed to come in at 9:45, and hopefully we'll get all set this week, come in at 10 o'clock, we can get some face-to-face time, which I really think I want to hear more from you. But for now, at least you can see the slide. Hopefully you can see the slide, that's what's coming up on your screen, and then what we're going to be talking about. And then if you don't want to comment through YouTube, you can comment through the chat on Web Campus. I know it's not perfect, just that WebEx is not, it's not allowing WebEx to work on the campus computer, and trying to run YouTube and campus, like trying to run WebEx on my computer is just problematic. So for right now, the first thing that I want to talk about, I'm glad I'm getting more people in because at least there is a connection there. Actually, just before we get any further, let me just set up one more thing. Let me message out the link for the first lecture, just in case people are not connecting to it just yet. Oh, goodness. Okay. There we go. All right, so that all being set up, let's actually get to the reason why we wanted to do this. Okay, we got 8 people. There's only 26 in the class. A lot of people didn't do the syllabus quiz, so I'm going to be emailing everyone who's sort of behind and sort of get everyone caught up. But for now, If I can just get everything in the right spot, I think we'll be ready to go. Okay. So, let's move this a little. And okay. Okay, so the first thing that I want to sort of talk about right now that we've got people in is this idea of the language that we're going to be speaking, right? That's part of the issue that I want us to get into. Is what terminology are we going to use? What understanding do we need? And I think part of this that has to be really clear is this idea of a shared terminology, a shared language, and this basis in science, right? Because while comparative politics, we think politics or we think social science, it is a grounded science. And so we're going to have to learn some scientific terminology. And so today I'm going to throw out in this first section of the lecture some things that are going to be very foreign for some of you, but I promise you it's going to come up again and again and again. And you're going to have more and more opportunities to discuss, to ask questions for all of those things. And if I get the WebEx working, if we get everything together, I came in really early and I've been working for a long time in this, so I'm very disappointed. But hopefully we can get everyone in and sort of discussing this aspect. So the first thing is when we're talking about this terminology that I want you to get into is how do we build the world that we're talking about? Now this is going to sound kind of crazy, but I want you to think about this as 3 different ways to build the world. And I'm not talking about we believe the world is different or we think that the world is real or not real. This isn't metaphysics, this isn't philosophy or theory or like political theory or like what is the world. This is actually just a scientific way of saying how are we going to look at the world, how are we going to build it, and what are we going to be talking about when we build it. So the first thing about this is this idea that when we're looking at the world, we can look at it objectively. And an objective reality, if we're treating the world as real, that it's real regardless of what we think, right? It doesn't matter if we have human observation, it doesn't matter what our perceptions are, there's a real world. Then when we're trying to look at the world, we can say that there are observable things that happen, and we can identify, by looking at those things, we can identify them. So there's a couple of assumptions involved in this. The first is that no matter who looks at it, they're going to see the same thing. Right? And for this, when we're talking about like counting things or calculating how many, right, counting or deciding if something exists, right? This is actually one of those things, right? If we want to say how many people died in a certain instance, an objective reality works. Did that person die? Are they dead, right? And so we find the people, we count them, right? They're physical bodies that we can count, right? So objective reality is really good for those things that are sort of direct, concrete, where you know what you're talking about and you're getting right into it. The next part is this idea of an intersubjective reality. Now, in an intersubjective reality, we may or may not have the world where we just clearly can see certain things, but there are some things that you can't just objectively sort of see or that don't just exist regardless of human perception or observation. And this is sort of a shared perception aspect. And what's clearest about this is that when we call something a table, when someone says, what is a table? We would all sort of come to the same comments about it being a flat surface, about it being off the ground, about it being, right, if you set something on it, it would hold it up, right? That's typically not for sitting on. That's a shared perception of what a table is. It's the simplest shared perception, right, we can really come up with. But why would we want to have a shared perception rather than just an objective reality? Because some things only exist in how they're perceived. And the part of this that really matters, excuse me, in part is this idea of, I can't already be losing my voice, is this idea of what currency is, right? When we talk about a dollar, right, it used to be that a dollar was worth a certain amount of gold. But that was quite a long time ago, right? In the 1970s, right, and into the 1980s, all nations and all states, they moved away from the gold standard. And so the value of a dollar, of a dollar bill, right, is just a piece of paper that we have faith and credit in, right? What is the difference between a $1 bill and a $20 bill, right? They're made of the same material, the same inks, right? The symbols on them make them different values. And we agree to respect those values. That's a shared perception, right? If you were to go to another country and you look at their currency, right, it would look very different because that's the shared perception of what currency should look like in that country, right? One of the things is that American money is the least colorful, right? That's just something that has always been sort of consistent. Right, but what is $20 worth, right? That's another thing, right? We agree in the Las Vegas area that $20 is worth a certain amount of goods or services, right? That's a shared perception. Because tomorrow that value could change, right? At every point, the value of certain things, right? The value of an apartment is probably decreased dramatically because people don't have to pay rent. There's a moratorium on evictions. So that's something that's shared. The next thing that we're going to talk about a lot in this class is values and norms, right? This is while I will never say what's right or wrong, the idea of what a culture believes is right or wrong, or what a population believes is right or wrong, that is actually something that we're going to see a lot of, right? That we're going to talk about a lot, things that they believe are wrong, right? A lot of the authors are going to talk about democracy as being a good thing, right? That it's a good norm, right? That people are better off under democracy normatively, right? That it's just a better way to live for those individuals, right? So we're going to talk about that. That's a shared perception. There's no way to look at just a democracy and see it as good or bad without values-based system. That's a shared perception. And then the last one is this idea of a subjective reality. And this is going to get a little more complex. There aren't as many subjective reality arguments that we're going to see, but I want you to know the three different ontologies that we're going to discuss, right? And this one is that we don't have shared perception, that our perceptions are influenced by past factors. And we're going to talk about this a lot. One is in feminist theory. And we can talk about radical feminism versus liberal feminism. Remember, this isn't social feminism. This is feminist theory in academic terms. So one of the things about feminist theory that they're going to argue, especially radical feminists are going to argue, is that females, right, those born biologically female, and I know we could get into debate about sex and gender, but that's not something that we will do in this class. It's just not something we have time for, especially now, right, with all the technology issues. So Janet Tinker in her text, right, talks about socialization, right? That females, as when they're very small, they play with baby dolls and ovens, and it used to be the case, right, that toys were very gendered, right? That females played with female toys, right? Feminine toys, excuse me. So as they're growing up, all of their perceptions in the world are in that socialized lens. They interact with the world as from a feminine lens, and it's different from a masculine lens. And when we talk about comparative politics, when we're talking about the difference between countries, is it a patriarchal country? How patriarchal? Does it have a matriarchal system? Are females seen very differently, right? I remember that, right, that I am an IR scholar, right? In the charter, the Hamas charter, and Hamas is a terrorist organization from the past, right? They talk about females as being producers of warriors, right? That's like saying that their role is to procreate and produce children. That's the role of cattle, right? So when you're talking about that, if they're treated as producers of warriors but not warriors themselves, their roles are going to be different, the perceptions are going to be different. And then there's a book by Charles Mills. I've always loved this book. I'm not sure about how accurate it is, right, because I don't have this perspective. And Charles Mills is a black male, and he makes the argument that black males, specifically, because he's writing from a black male perspective, right, his perceptions as a black male. And so every day when he walks through life, he's treated as a black male, constantly, and so his perceptions are very different. And he uses a very old perception, which I honestly don't know. I'm from California, so it's very different. There aren't bodegas. But he talks about, as a black male, if you go into a shop or a bodega in the East Coast, you're much more likely to be followed or accused of theft than if you were a white male or a female or some other ethnicity or group, right? So that's the perception. And over time, what we call socialization is over time, these experiences change your perception. That when a female or a black male sees something, they are seeing something different than what another person is seeing, right? Often feminist theory makes this the clearest, right? When a male walks home at night and they see another male, they just perceive another male. When a female walks home at night alone and she sees a male, she's more likely to perceive a threat, right? That's the difference. That's why subjective really is really something we want to make sure that we discuss. Okay, I really like that people are coming in. I know that the technology's just been a mess. We should be able to really sort of break this out. I feel like the YouTube's going good, and actually the other computer's right here. It's got the webcam, so if I just the WebEx, it would all be in one spot, and we can get through it. I'm glad everyone's coming in. Okay, so that's ontology, right? And I know it's difficult. This is not the first time that we're going to bring it up. It will be on the first exam, but I promise you we'll talk about it until you're sick of it, and you know it very well. So on repeat. And I'm going to give you like more quizzes and ways to learn about it. So that's how we build the world, right? How are we designing this world? And think about it from a scientific perspective. We always sort of change the world a little bit. It's called abstraction. We say we're going to talk about the world in this way or this manner. So now we have a world. So now that we have this world, how are we going to know this world? How are we going to gain knowledge? And there's a lot of ways to gain knowledge, and this is called epistemology, or epistemology. And this is how you gain knowledge in the world and understanding in the world. And if you have questions, remember chat, the chat in Web Campus or the YouTube chat. Hopefully I'll be able to see your faces soon so we can have some more direct conversation. But for now, you can always ask those questions. And if you don't have a YouTube, you have to have access to Web Campus, and it's just in the chat. I'm in the chat right now, just in case you want to link into that. So we're talking about the knowledge of things. There's a couple of ways. The one that we want to talk about the most is the scientific method. How do we learn in a scientific method is very clear. It's universal, right? Whether you're a hard science or social science, it's going to follow a very similar pattern. The first is observation, right? You see something, you think, well, I don't really understand how that works, but I have an idea, right? I have a clue, I have a hint, I have an intuition, right? And it's perfectly acceptable. You don't know how it works, but you're going to take a guess. So then you form a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a very specific term that means a question that you're testing, right? You're going to say, I believe that gravity causes things to fall to the ground. So I believe that. So I'm going to test it, right? When I drop things from a height, will they drop to the ground? So that's the data collection. And you're going to collect data as you go, and then you're going to revise. Now, this is a cyclical concept, right? The idea of a scientific method. It's not you go through it once and then you're done. It's when you revise, you have a new observation, you form a refined hypothesis, and then you continue to collect data, right? So the scientific method is ever approaching. Now, we'll talk about this later, but one of the important things is that if you get new evidence, new data, that changes what your hypothesis was before, right, then it changes. That doesn't mean you were wrong before. That just means that you didn't have enough data or evidence, right, for a clear picture, right? We know that we originally thought the Earth was the universe, center of the universe, right? And then you have Galileo and Copernicus, right? And they use new research technologies to show that we're not the center of the universe, that we revolve around the sun, right? So that's the process, the scientific method process. So when you're going through that process, the scientific method, there are a couple things you can do. The first is empirical research. So empirical research is this idea of using your senses to look into the world and say, I can see certain things, or I can notice certain things, I can observe certain things, right? Now, for other sciences, you have like taste, touch, smell, all of these other things here, right? But for us, it's pretty much just what did you witness, right? What did you see, right? Did you count votes, right? Did you see anyone being harassed at a polling place, right? What can we observe? So that's empirical research. Now, empirical research is very important, but it's not the only way we can know things, right? Empirical research is what we can see, count, right, know through observation. The next part about gaining knowledge is called inductive reasoning. And this is going to be a huge part of comparative politics. And it's going to be a huge part about your knowledge gaining in this class. Because a lot of you may not be political scientists, and because of that, you're going to hit this point where you're like, I don't need to know more about comparative politics. I don't need to know more about Italy or South Korea, or whatever the case is that I introduce. What will help you in the long run is this understanding of how arguments work and being able to take evidence that you have and then making a logical extension of those things, right? And so here I have this example, right? We assume humans are rational. And we're going to talk about rational choice a lot, so don't worry about what rational means yet. And so they choose not to vote, right? So if we think humans are rational, we make this assumption about them, and we'll talk about what it means to make an assumption. Because it's not just, oh, I assume, it involves a lot more processing. And then we go to this idea that, okay, they chose not to vote, so then we can argue that those people, for them, right, the cost of voting is not worth the reward, right? If you are a libertarian candidate, you know your candidate's not going to win in the American system because it's a two-party system, so you may choose not to vote at all, right? And that is a rational choice. It is not a moral choice because we have this sort of civic duty that exists in the United States, but it can be a rational choice. And then the last one that we're going to talk about a lot is probability theory. Now, I don't need you to know the math. This is not that course, right? There's like a 300-level course that teaches you statistics. I need you to speak the language. I don't need you to know the math, right? And so when I'm talking about probability theory, what I really just want you to know is this is just statistics. We're going to use statistics. Now, we're not going to actually do statistics in this class, but when I talk about statistics as a quantitative method, I want you to know what that means. And so this comes from probability theory. And it's an idea of likelihood. So if I have a variable x, right, there's a certain percentage of y occurring, right? So we'll talk about this when we get the Scotch poll later on. If we have elites who aren't working together, right, they have a big disagreement, then you have a greater likelihood of revolution. Because one of those groups is likely to reach out to the proletariat, and the proletariat will want to change in the system, which is how you get a revolution. The other part about probability theory and statistics is it's not deterministic. And determinism means the outcome follows, right? If I drop something from this height, it's going to fall, right? That's determinism, right? Gravity works a certain way near the surface of the earth, right? That's just 32 feet per second, right? That is how gravity works on the surface of the earth, right? So that's deterministic. That's going to happen unless something intervenes. Probability theory just says this is the highest likelihood. And statistics often does this. This is the most likely outcome, or this is the outcome that is likely to occur given the certain characteristics. So that's another way that we can know things. So we've gone through ontology, we've gone through epistemology, so now we're going to talk about methodology. So when we talk about methodology, I really just want you to know quantitative versus qualitative. And then we'll get through the rest as we go through the course. So quantitative, numbers, right? And for us, it's going to be almost always statistics. There are some count variables. The Monk and Snyder piece that we're going to talk, that we might get to today, we're already a little behind, but the Monk and Snyder piece we should get to either today or next week. The part about that is, right, that they use counts. They say how many of these articles have these characteristics, right? And so they're like, oh, they counted, and they looked at that as a percentage. That's just pure math, right? There's no statistics, there's no regression, there's no high-level math. They counted, and they said, okay, 200 of the 319 articles reference this, and so it's 63%, right? Or 65%, or whatever it is, right? So that's just counting. And it's very informative. It can be very informative to count. Right? I specialize in international relations and conflict. That's the thing that I focus most of my mental capacity on. And we count battle deaths. How many people died in this conflict? And how many armed combatants died fighting against each other, right? That's a count measure, but it's very informative to us to know how big a conflict is, right? Did 100 people die in this conflict this year? Did 10,000, right? What's the size of the conflict, the intensity of the conflict? So counts can be very, very, very useful. Statistics is a much more advanced methodology that we won't get into, but we'll discuss what its value is, but a while I won't teach you what statistics actually is, because you have a whole course for that if you're political science. And I think almost all majors require some version of statistics, so I'll leave that to your statistics lecturers. When we're talking about qualitative, this is words, it's characteristics. So the benefit of qualitative, it's much thicker. We use this word of thick, right? It's thick description, right? And it's not this like stigmatized version of description. Description can be very informative. It can give a scientific method. It can provide us a lot of information. So thick description involves two different ways that we can go about this. The first is a case study. And a case study is just an in-depth analysis of a state or a subnational unit like a county, or just a number of, well, not individuals, but a number of cases, a number of states, or an entire region, right, the EU, or right, the entire Western European region, and it just goes through a lot of the details and characteristics that exist. And this allows us to include culture and religion and values in our research, right? It allows us to understand what is the role of these things. The other thing is process tracing, and we won't get to this for a while, so don't worry about knowing this completely. I will introduce it again multiple times. So process tracing is going chronologically through a number of events. And as you're going through certain events, identifying certain events that had impact and what impact they had. And the most obvious historical example is the idea of Archduke Ferdinand, right? So in World War I, right, there was this argument that hostilities were high, and there were all of these issues, and then the Archduke was assassinated. And when the Archduke was assassinated, because the tensions were high, it triggered a domino effect of conflict, right? That's process tracing. We followed from protectionism and trade policy into the assassination and then the lead into conflict. That's process tracing. And we identified through the story that we're telling chronologically, right, over time, right, starting from the beginning and traveling through time naturally, right, that involves us and provides us a lot of information. Okay. When we're talking about methodology, the methodology that you should select is always driven in a process from ontology to epistemology to methodology. So the biggest thing is if you choose an objective reality, if you say we can count things, we can observe them, then you're much more likely to say, I'm going to do empirical research. I'm going to look at things. I'm going to observe them directly. And because you're doing empirical research without inductive reasoning, right, it's deductive. I'm going to count things, I'm going to look at them, I'm going to see how many instances of election interference exist, right? And I'm not using the U.S. as an example. We're not going to talk about the U.S. I don't think we have enough information yet for me to discuss it to you, right? So the U.S. is not something we're going to talk about a lot in comparative politics. We try to avoid it because you have an American class where you will talk about only the United States. But I'm going to do empirical research. So I'm much more likely to do quantitative methodology because I'm looking at values. Now, if I think the world is subjective, where our perceptions don't align, where you can't just look at the natural world, then these are out, right? And I need inductive reasoning. I need to make a series of logical arguments. And because I'm making a series of logical arguments and I'm not sort of observing the world directly, then instead of a quantitative metric, I need a qualitative metric, right? I need a case study where I describe the world as it's being perceived by the people involved. Or process tracing to help people explain how the process went through and led to whatever outcome we're talking about. All right, so that's the process, right? The theory and the literature and the world that you're building that tells you how you understand the world, right? If you think only perception matters, right, then it's not an empirical research. It can still be empirical in the idea that it's scientific, right? But you're going to look at logical aspects, inductive reasoning, right? Other ways to go about it. Now, all of those things follow, and then we're going to talk about two terms that become very problematic for political science students and students in general, is this idea of an independent and dependent variable. And I want you to reduce these ideas to something very simple. An independent variable is a cause. It causes something to happen, right? Now, we make an assumption that it's not influenced by the dependent variable. Right, that the independent variable is a cause and it does something, right? But it's not impacted by something else. The dependent variable is an effect, right? It occurs because something else happens. And so if you have a change in the independent variable, then you should expect a change in the dependent variable, right? Now we have intermediate variables, so we'll talk about this a lot, where you have some independent variable occur, it leads to sort of an intermediate variable, and then it leads to the dependent variable, right? We have an election where votes are counted. One person is nominated the winner, right? I'm going to talk about the president for just a second because the process occurs, right? Then, because the votes are cast, it goes to an intermediate variable, the electoral college, and the electoral college selects a president. So why we vote for the president, right, the intermediate variable is the electoral college. And we can see that chain occur. Now, one of the things I want to be very clear about is we're going to avoid monocausal explanations. And monocausal explanations is just where you're saying there's one thing and it caused this other thing to occur, right? One cause and one effect. Now, that's not really true. Yes, Archduke Ferdinand's death really did it increased the likelihood of a war, but it's not like he died and then war happened, right? There are other factors, there are other things going on. So whenever you say it's just one thing, right, think about how many factors do we need to discuss, right? What other things do we need to include? And let's make sure that we're including all the factors that we can. Okay. I think I prepared way too much material, but if we fall behind, I'll adjust the exams to only meet the material that we talked about. So I mentioned a couple times about assumptions. And what I want you to know about assumptions is that this is the idea that we set up assumptions to say this is things that we're going to treat as true for the argument. It doesn't mean they're universally true. It does not mean that they will always be true. It doesn't even mean that they are true for the argument they produce. But we're going to assume that they're true, right? We're going to make this assumption and say these things are true because they are for the argument I'm producing. And we have some very clear examples. The first is that rational choice assumes individuals will choose an alternative that provides the greatest reward. Now, if you don't know what that formula means, right, it just means reward equals the probability of the benefit minus the cost. I'm not going to test you on that. Don't worry about that. The point of this assumption is that we assume that humans are going to do the thing that provides them the greatest reward, right? And reward is defined as, right, how much did you get and how much did it cost to get you that thing, right? If you went out and paid $1 for a lottery ticket, right, and you won 100 million, you would be up quite a bit in the cost versus the benefit. But the probability of you winning that 100 million is less than 1 in 100 million, right? So you actually lose some reward, right? The return on your investment is negative, right? So it's not necessarily rational to buy a lottery ticket. And we're in Las Vegas and there's gambling, right? But we have to take into account other impacts and other factors. Now, we're not going to really talk about feminist theory as much because it's more of an IR course to cover it, although I don't know if they're actually covered in IR courses. But one of the things about radical feminism, as an academic theory, is this assumption that females are socialized to be feminine. Now, not all females are socialized to be feminine, right? But during their formative years, a good percentage of females are taught to wear pink and dresses and hold baby dolls and act as caretakers or given an Easy Bake Oven, if Easy Bake Ovens even exist today. And so this causes this assumption that is the basis of their argument, right? That females are feminized in their youth as children, and then as they grow, it's more and more put on them to act a certain way, to socialize. They're socialized into a certain behavior, so that by the time they are adults, their whole perception, right? Their whole identity is modified to fit into a feminine identity, right? So socialization is how that occurs. And you're more than welcome to disagree about gender and sex and feminization and socialization of young females, but it's not really something we're going to discuss. I'm just using it as an example, and if you want to read up, there are plenty of authors that could explain it better than I could. And then I talked about Charles Mills, right? His assumption is that individuals of color have interactions that are different from their white counterparts, right? This is actually something that we talk about a lot in today's society, right? It used to be very appropriate to say that you were colorblind, and now it's not, right? It's not, because you're sort of ignoring all of the things that happen and all the interactions and the perceptions of others that are put on those individuals, right? And how that influences their perception of the world. All right. So remember, we want this to be a scientific endeavor. So what's the scientific minimum? The bare minimum for scientific. The first is that it's falsifiable. That it has to have the possibility that the hypothesis is inaccurate. Wrong, needs modification. If there is no way, if there's no evidence, there's nothing that can be presented that would change the scientist's mind about the hypothesis, they're saying this is right no matter what evidence, then that's not a scientific approach. Now, I'm not religious, I can't speak to religion, I actually didn't grow up with religion, right? But one of the arguments about religion is that he is, right, God, whatever version of the religion, right, that this creator is perfect and therefore must exist, right? And so that's an argument that is not falsifiable. You cannot present evidence of non-existence, right? Those are things that are not falsifiable. And so religion is by its very nature not scientific, which I don't think anyone would argue that religion is scientific. I don't think that has to be a thing. I don't know anything about Scientology, but there is no evidence that any religion would argue it's scientific, right? The adoption of science maybe, but right, belief is beyond science or considered to be beyond science. So in order for it to be falsifiable, right, has to be that if new evidence was presented, you could say, oh no, it's possible that this could be wrong. The other thing is repeatability. Now, if you were in a hard science and you said, oh, these cookies bake best at 325 degrees, someone else could take those cookies in the same conditions, right, sort of control for the pan and the size of the cookies, and bake them at 325, and they should get similar results, very close to the same results. Now, that doesn't work for us because, as we'll talk about in the next section, right, repeating something is not really appropriate. I can't make, right, World War II happening, and that would be very unethical, and it would not work, right? So repeatability works very differently. In comparative politics, repeatability is that you can go to the same sources, you can read the same text, you can look at the same historical events, and you can come to the same sort of similar argument, or you can understand the logic of the argument presented by the other author, right? So you're not quite repeating the events, it is more that you are taking into account that the events occurred and you can find the same evidence and use it the same way to produce the same argument. Even if you consider it flawed, you could still produce the same argument. All right. So now we can't, is this idea that we can't really just test the real world, right? And so what has to happen is abstraction. And an abstraction is just where we take sort of the real world and we modify it slightly, or we ignore certain aspects so we can test hypotheses. And all scientific work has to abstract to some extent, right? Physicists will always say in a vacuum or near the surface of the earth, right? A lot of chemists controlled environment, right? They make sure their environment is controlled, there aren't extraneous sources, right? They don't do it outside in the wind, right? They do it inside a lab, right? It's a very controlled environment. So it's not actually reality they're testing, it's an abstraction away from reality. This allows greater generalization, right? If I abstract from reality and I say, oh, in these conditions and it causes this effect, right? It allows me to generalize to other cases, not just the specific case I'm working on. The opposite is this specificity. And this is really the sort of debate that you always see in comparative politics. I can look at one case and I can find all of these similarities and differences between cases with all of these great details, and it produces this great internal logic, right? If I look at Western European states, I see a lot of similarities where France and Europe and other nations, they built their identity through conflict. That's a very normal thing. And it creates this internal logic of France and England about becoming nations through competition. But if we try to take that same logic and we try to apply it to other places in the world like sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't hold because while it's very specific, it's not very generalizable. And abstraction becomes one of those things that's very useful when we're trying to generalize our arguments, right? If you find this really great argument, or you really find a way to explain why conflict is occurring in Eastern Europe, you would hope that you could generalize that and use those same arguments to say, okay, I understand why conflict's occurring in Eastern Europe. There are similar factors in Africa, and I can help explain those, right? And while we talk about not being as policy relevant, you still want to be able to identify ways in which you can improve the world, right? And then we'll talk about that when we get to normative theory. Okay. So here are some questions that I want you to ask yourself when you're going through the readings. And I should have had this up earlier, but I really wanted to refine these to make sure that you could see them as I was talking and have an opportunity to ask questions. The first is, what is the nature of the world in this reading? This is the ontology question. Is this individual describing a perception, a subjective world, an intersubjective world? Are we agreeing on values in this article that I'm reading? Is this an objective reality? Is this person counting, right? Monk and Snyder are counting. They're an objective reality, right? That's their ontology, is an objective reality. What is the way the author learns about the world? When we look at Peters isn't adding this any numbers. He's not using observation. He does have some observation. He's using logic, right? He's using inductive reasoning. And he's using, in large part, this intersubjective, this agreement on what is being observed is through the lens of someone, right? We're agreeing on the perceptions that we have. Not that we can observe the direct reality, because we're talking about norms and values and cultures, and there's a lens that's going through, but that's an intersubjective, which leads to this epistemology of inductive reasoning. So it's a good question for you to ask, what's the epistemology of the article that you're reading? And if you can answer these questions as you're going through them, you're going to be much more prepared to understand the reading that you're going through. The next part is really easy, right? Is it qualitative or quantitative methodology? And is it a good approach? Now this is going to get more complicated because a lot of people err on the side of quantitative methodology. But in comparative politics specifically, the methodology really is dependent on the ontology and the epistemology. What world are you building? How do we know that world? Well, that will inform you about the type of methodology they're using. And if you're reading something, you're like, they're talking about perception the whole time, and then they use quantitative methodology, you might argue that's not the best approach to get the most accurate results, because perceptions are not easily quantified. They're not easily counted and put into numbers, right? If I were to ask you all how you feel about an 8 a.m. class, I wouldn't get a number, I would get groans, right? It was very natural, right, to not be happy about it, right? But how do I quantify that, the level of that, right? It's much more difficult. So maybe a qualitative method. Maybe the words that you use to describe having this class would be much more useful. What is the author assuming, right? If it's rational choice, they're assuming that the cases being studied have rational individuals or rational actors, or the states are rational, right? What does that mean to have that assumption? And then, do you accept the argument, right? Everything you read, you don't have to accept. There are a lot of articles that you read that some of the methodology is questionable. Some of the arguments are questionable. You have the right to question the logic, right? But when you're questioning it, argue, why is it, right? Why is this argument not holding? What is wrong about this argument? What is the flaw that I see in this argument? And then this, if you get a chance, this is much, much, much harder, right? For all of us, this is harder. It's harder for me. Is this argument about, am I reacting to this reading because my values and the arguments don't coalesce, right? Am I not willing to accept this argument, right? I'm biased, right? Instructor Worthy, I am biased, right? I happen to be a vegan. It's not really relevant to any of the work. But if someone produced a scientific study that said it was bad for you to be vegan, then I would not want to accept that article. I would want to reject it because my values are tied into being vegan, right? So I would want to reject that. But I would not be rejecting it on empirical grounds. I would be rejecting it because it doesn't align with my values. So when he can, if it's possible, see is, okay, do I disagree with this argument because I don't like it or because I see flaws in its empirical structure? And that's something that can really benefit you when you're discussing this aspect of the literature. All right, so give me 1 second, and let me see if I can. Is this going to work? Of course it's not. Okay, hold on one. Okay. So we're going to transition to the Peters book. That way, okay. So now hopefully you can see me when we go through. So this is the first chapter of the Peters book. It's a really great summary of comparative politics. It's just if I have you read it, we're going to miss so many other things. And I don't want to get bogged down in one book. These books can... Everything gets all authors get kind of repetitive. That's a natural practice. So what I'd like is to give you a little piece of everything. And when I was an undergrad, this is one of those things where I got a piece of everything, and then something just stuck with me. Right? There's a book by King, Cohane, and Verba that's a methodology book that I really liked, and there's an author named Fearon, right? That I read one of his articles, and then I read a bunch of his other stuff because it really caught. And getting exposed to a lot of different authors really can help. So I had you read one chapter. If you like it, continue on. If you want to be in comparative politics, Peter's book is very good. Peter's is actually very well known. He has more work that's more recent, but is a very well-known author that can really help. So without gushing over him anymore, let's get into this. So this next part, okay. We are going to take a break at 9:45, so I will take a break. I'll stop this session. I'll start a new live session. I'll give everyone time to jump back in. And so 9:45 to 10, and then over that time, I'm going to have classroom services come in. But I want to get into this because we're already so far behind, and it's my fault. So Peter starts with this argument about experiment versus comparison. And the first argument that he's discussing is this idea that hard sciences, they use experimentation as a primary method. But there's a whole host of reasons why we wouldn't use experimentation in comparative politics. In political science in general, experimentation is a bad idea. The first part is it's typically not ethical. It would be highly unethical for me to go into Lagos and to tweak their policies or to change their election rules to test a hypothesis, right? To impact another country, another state, another government that way for scientific experimentation would be very wrong, right? The other part is that experiments control a lot of things. If you ever think about an experiment, there are all of these controls, right? It's in a petri dish or it's in a still, right, depending on what type of experiments you've done. But there are so many, there's temperature control, and you're inside and you control the temperature of the world, and you make sure not to move anything or jostle because the shaking could have kinetic energy, right? There's all of these things you can control. Well, the real world doesn't work that way, right? The real world is deeply chaotic, right? And so because of that, experimentations aren't really appropriate in political science in general, because you will typically not reflect the real world, and that's what we want, right? And the last part is this concept of context, right? What is context? So France has a very different culture from Italy, right? When we're talking about France, one of the things about France is it had all of this social capital. The population was very involved in politics. And then Putnam makes this argument, in Italy there was no social capital. The people weren't used to involving themselves in politics. So when democratization was going through Italy, it didn't get as much traction, it didn't stick as well to become a democratic country as easily, because they weren't used to being involved in elections and other decisions. So Italy's culture, its political capital, its involvement in politics was not the same as France. And then in Nigeria, you have very different culture. You have different belief systems, right? And France and Italy versus Nigeria makes Nigeria sound like an outsider. But Nigeria's culture actually had a lot of social capital. There was communalism, but it was just treated very differently. And all three cultures have very different behaviors. And so you can't just say we're going to do an experiment, because under what culture, under what beliefs, under what restraints, right? Italy, under a downturn, economic downturn that's struggling, is much more likely to accept an authoritarian leader than France, right? France, when they're in a bad position, right, sort of the French Revolution, they get rid of their elites, right? Italy embraces elites and sort of embraces fascism when things are going poorly for them. So we're not getting a great reality if we're using an experiment. It's just not very functional for comparative politics. Now, one of the things that we talk about in comparative politics is the difference between normative and empirical. And I've actually said this a lot, and this is where I come from. This is why it's so easy for me to make these arguments when I'm teaching comparative politics or international relations, is because normative theory exists. There is a normative theory that is, its goal is to identify and produce the good life. This is, right, Plato's Utopia, and Immanuel Kant's intrinsic value of man, right? And Locke's alienation about forming communities. And Hobbes about without sort of governance, the world is nasty and brutish and solitary and short, right? That life is bad without sort of governance. And so they all come to these arguments about the best way to have the good life, the life where you get the things you want and you're engaged and your voice matters, is a democratic rule, right? Is voting for your leaders or leading yourself, right? Involving in those things. And those become normative aspects. But the reason why I won't be discussing them is because they are a different type of research, right? A political theorist will be the one who will be discussing that with you, right? And they'll talk to you about those things. And I think I misspoke a lot, but don't worry about that. Yeah, very frustrating. So the aspect of this, I can't. So the aspect of this that I want you to take away is that normative theory has value. I won't be discussing it because it's not my specialty. It's not the thing that I do. The next part is empirical theory. And empirical theory is the things that we're going to be talking about. It's my expertise, right? It's the thing that I am going to discuss with you, and it's much more appropriate in comparative politics in the works that we will be discussing. And we want to have descriptively accurate information. It's very important that it's descriptively accurate. In the 1950s and sort of before the 1960s, scientists would go to other countries, and one of the arguments that they would make is that females weren't involved in politics, right? Especially if they went to like the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa. The reason they thought this is because all the researchers were male. And right, they live in segregated societies. A lot of places live in segregated societies. And so these male researchers weren't seeing females in political arenas. Well, that wasn't a problem of females not being involved in politics. There's still sort of this issue of females not getting as much involved in politics. But they weren't witnessing, they weren't observing the females because the females were segregated into their own political community and would discuss politics among their own group of females. So it wasn't that they sort of had bad conclusions, they had inaccurate information. And so it's so important that it's descriptively accurate. How we're describing the case, the state, the environment has to be accurate from the observations that we collect. And we want to make sure the observations are as neutral, don't have the least amount of bias that's possible. There's always going to be some bias in the same way that there's always going to be some error, right? But you want to make sure you minimize it as much as possible. And then for comparative politics, right, it's called comparative politics because it's based on comparison. That can be between states, it can be within states, or it can be across time. And we'll actually talk about that moving forward. So here we have this sort of thick versus thin analysis. The thick analysis, the thing about the thick analysis is that it has very different characteristics, but what we have seen is, in publications specifically, a preference for quantitative analysis, specifically statistical regressions or regression analysis. The problem with that is they provide different things. This is a trade-off in the same way that abstraction and specificity are trade-offs. Qualitative is thick. It provides all of these details. It provides context, right? It's closer to reality. If I were to give you a case study of France, it would be much closer to reality than giving you the GDP of France, the education level of France, right? The Freedom House score of what democracy score it has, right? That's not as close to reality as a thick description of the case. The problems with that is it includes the author's lens. What's the perception of the author? When Tocqueville came to the United States, he was French, and so when he would see the American democracy in function, it seemed sort of gangly and people were involved because it wasn't the clear sort of bureaucracy and decision-making and elite decision-making that existed in France, right? But that was a Frenchman's perspective of American democracy, which would have been different, right? Which is why Schumpeter's is different. And I know I'm throwing a lot of author names at you. I will very rarely ask you to remember an author name unless I tell you I'm going to be discussing it. You should know the author's names of the articles we're reading, but there are just so many names, I don't expect you to get them all in the first pass. Now, one of the barriers for qualitative research is you need a greater understanding of the cases. You need to understand the cases and what matters in those cases. If you don't speak the language, it's very difficult to understand that case. If you don't really understand the culture of that area, it's very difficult to understand that case, right? Dr. Tahmin Anfour, who is a professor here at UNLV, one of his arguments is that if you're not Arabic, or you don't speak Arabic, or you don't understand Arabic culture, then you can't really understand the underpinnings of what's happening in certain parts of the world, right? If you don't understand the culture or speak the language, and Iran is not Arabic, it's Persian Farsi. If you don't have that culture or speak that language, right, then it's very difficult for you to gain knowledge of that case, right? It's very hard for you to understand that, and so that's a barrier. Now, on the quantitative side, it's thin, but it's really easy to get data points. I can look at GDP, I can look at the average age, I can look at the education level by year, right? I can look at all those things very clearly. It also avoids bias, right? There's no lens to look at, right, the amount of money that the country made in a year, or the education level, or the amount of children that died, right, the infant mortality rate. Those are numbers, and so there's a lot of bias out of them. But unfortunately, if you look at quantitative research, what it tends to not involve as much is religion, because religion is very hard to quantify, right? You can say this region is this religion and give it some simple dummy variable, it either is or it is not, but it's very hard to have those. And so quantitative research is often omitting things that may really have an impact, like culture and religion. It's easier to identify the research methodology when we're talking about quantitative work, because they point to it, right? X causes Y in this fashion, right? It's methodological, it's mathematical, right? There are all those aspects. The barrier here is that you need statistical analysis training. Right now, as freshmen and sophomore and maybe even juniors taking this course, you have a much better understanding of certain cases, right? Especially if you're from another country, if you're experienced in another country, your understanding of some cases might be very strong, whereas for the most of you, your statistical analysis is much weaker, right? But I can train you, the university, UNLV, can train you on statistical analysis. It is much harder to train someone on the understanding of certain cases. So that's part of the process that we're dealing with. Yeah, I created way more that's going to be necessary. All right. I don't see any questions so far. That doesn't mean you guys don't have questions, but when we come back after the break, what did I do? Okay. When we come back to the break, if you have more questions, just let me know. So, when we're talking about comparative politics, one of the things is that we need ontology, we need the building of the world, we need epistemology, we need to understand how we understand the world. And what this leads to is the role of knowledge and theory, and that we have to have decisions made by the authors about what is important, what should I include? Is religion an important aspect in American government? Does it determine certain behaviors? Right? Does it matter if there's a higher population of Buddhists in certain states? Will those states behave differently, right? That requires the knowledge of the individual who understands the impact of certain religions on policy. Especially if we start talking about places like the Netherlands or Lebanon, which we'll talk about later, that have very large and very different religious groups that want different things in their government, right? Then it has an impact. Whereas in places like California, and here, right, libertarian values sort of overrule sort of religious values in certain ways, right? That religious decisions aren't really driving a lot of the decisions of the state right now because other factors at play. Not that they can't, but right, COVID concerns, economic concerns are sort of driving it more than other things. So when you have an epistemic community, right, these are all the scholars and the authors and the scientists and even the policymakers and the people in office to elected officials, right? These are the authors that come together and sort of identify all the relevant factors. They agree on the terminology, right? We're talking about speaking the same language. It's not my language. It's a language that the epistemic community came up with. All the scholars, all the people involved in academic work of this field, right, sort of defining things, agreeing on definitions, and that helps identify what's important, what is relevant, what factors can include. So when you have this type of community, there are a lot of theories that they generated, right? And remember, a theory is not a hypothesis. A hypothesis is sort of a testable guess, right? A hypothesis is, I think things are worth, let's test it. A theory is very different. A theory are these arguments that you make so to give precision and accuracy to your research, right? I'm going to define the world based on these arguments, or these arguments suggest, right? When we talk about rational choice theory, the argument rational choice theory argues that people will seek out the most reward they can get, that they will, right, calculate a number of different alternatives before making a decision, and because of that, their behavior is going to lead to a certain way, right? That's not a guess, that's, right, an argument about how people behave in certain cases. And then knowledge. One of the things that you'll notice about comparative politics is that the individuals have either lived in that country, right, or that state for a long time, right? Dr. Tamananfour was in Iran, grew up in Iran, right, came here much later. His knowledge of Iranian politics and government is very strong because he lived there. He lived through it, right? The other way, right, that Dr. Kenzie, right, in Senegal, she went to Senegal and she lived with the people and she developed a rapport and learned the language, right, and really gained knowledge of the culture and the practices and the traditions to understand that case. And so in comparative politics, understanding a case is really a great knowledge tool and lets you know what's important, right? What is important in Senegal is very different from what's important in Iran, but Dr. Tamananfour knows Iran and Dr. Kenzie knows Senegal, right? That's their knowledge is individual based. And some, I'm sure they have other countries, but those are the ones that come up the most in discussion. So here, there are going to be 5 types of comparative politics. So these are the 5 types, but I want to put this in after the break. So I really appreciate you guys being here. I know it's just been a mess. The live stream is going to pick up at 10, so in 15 minutes. I have to drink some fluids and sort of just process through and try to get some things fixed. If you were on the WebEx chat earlier, I'm going to try and get up there running classroom services coming in. If I can get it running, there will be a WebEx because I would like to see you and maybe you'd feel more comfortable asking a question with your voice rather than typing it out in chat, even though, right, if you have a question, you can always email me too if that's the option. But once we get all of that up and running, what I would like is to have, right, I have to have the YouTube for the recording, but I'd also like to get you as many in WebEx as possible. I'd like to be able to see your face, right? Or sort of communication. I just was sort of talking to a colleague, and there's a lot of research that if you can speak a question, you're more likely to say it than type it out, and I want to provide you with the most possible answers. If I'm speaking too slow, if I am not clear, I know I'm speaking with a mask on, say something, you will not offend me. I promise you, whatever you say, unless it violates the policies, you're not going to offend me. All I'll say is you can't say that in a classroom, right? But you will not offend me. So as we're going through, just make sure that if something's not clear, ask that. Okay, we're coming back to this in 15 minutes. I will see you at 10 o'clock. Thank you.